Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. And this is episode 86 of the Lyceum Roundtable. I'm joined by Keith Preston and Swithin Dobson. Haven't heard any word from Terminal Philosophy, so I don't know what's up on his end. Maybe he'll join later. So we're covering What If Alt Hist again. He's one of those really interesting YouTubers. Just briefly for anybody who doesn't know who he is, I don't know, maybe like 6-7 years ago, he got started doing what was considered rather niche alternative history. So the idea where you speculate, well, at this turning point in history, what if it went some other way? And that's sort of how he got started finding his niche. And I guess he still does that to some degree, but it seems like a lot of his current work is more like, well, what might the future look like? So rather than like, what might an alternative past be? It's more like, what might the future look like? Which I guess is a natural progression from such a thing. But he's also very well read in a lot of different historical, sociological, economic positions, and brings together a lot of different lenses to analyze events. And so what I'll tell people is, even if I don't personally agree with all of his takes, he usually finds a way to make you think, which is more than considered about most people on YouTube. The video that we're discussing today is The Secret History of the 20th Century, which the link is actually included in the show notes for anyone who wants to watch afterwards. The basic premise of this video is that there were that the 20th century, far from being an age of rationalism and science and all this stuff, was actually a war of religion between three groups: liberalism, fascism, and communism. And so he basically says, to sort of just open it up, science, right? The quote unquote age of science says the only thing that we can measure is what's real. If we can't measure it, it's not real. But what ends up happening is the things that we can't measure are still very much real and end up motivating our behavior. And those end up being, in his words, what then determines what the liberals, the fascists, and the communists consider science. The sort of like the unproven assumptions that guide research are basically those, I guess you might say, Freudian id things that we're not allowed to admit exist. And so then what this actually means in his mind and others is that the 20th century was an age of superstition and religious warfare rather than rationalism and science. And that the scientific, a lot of the dysfunction we have in the modern world today is as a result of forcing ourselves to think that this other half of reality doesn't exist. He makes the distinction between the left and right half of the brain. The left half he considers to be more measurement, science-oriented, but also concerned only with things like power and wealth, but also extremely gullible because it lacks nuance, lacks the ability to parse out differences. Whereas the right half of the brain, poetry, religion, philosophy, is left out. And he argues that this imbalance is what's driving both these three religions that are competing in the 20th century, as well as the dysfunction we're seeing in the beginning of the 21st. So we'll start with that. That's how he frames all of this, Keith. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, what he's doing is building on the insights of some earlier thinkers. Now, I don't know to what degree he's familiar with some of these, but way back in the 19th century, Nietzsche predicted that the 20th century would be a time of great wars between rival secular religions, because there's a famous passage from one of Nietzsche's works. It's called The Gay Science, which has nothing to do with gay in the modern sense, but it's about how it's called The Parable of the Madman, and it's about how this madman ventures into a village and he says, "I'm in search of God." The madman is sort of like the stereotypical shaman, type of mystic that seems kind of crazy, but just kind of wanders off into the wilderness. And he says, "I'm in search of God." And the people in the village are saying, "No, we killed God." And he's talking about the impact of the Enlightenment on organized religion. And then he just kind of laughs at them and says, "No, you haven't." And what the message of this story, though, is that Nietzsche is saying that what the intellectuals of his time period were doing in the mid to late 19th century was they were simply replacing traditional religion, not just traditional religion, but traditional values or norms or culture generally. They were replacing that with new secular ideologies. And it was during this time when you were seeing the rise of things like socialism, communism, nationalism, as well as scientific or pseudoscientific philosophies like eugenics, and all of these kinds of things were becoming social Darwinism. These kinds of things were all becoming prevalent among intellectuals in Europe in the 19th century. And Nietzsche was saying, well, these are just new religions. It's not that people have become more rational. They've just developed new doctrines and new superstitions and that kind of thing. And he predicted that in the 20th century is when all these things would come to a head. You'd start to see clashes between these different belief systems. And that's what we had in the 20th century. So that's a fairly important insight there. And Carl Schmitt also wrote about this. Like, one of Carl Schmitt's works was called The Nomos of the Earth. And he was writing during the Cold War. And he was saying that the Cold War is really a religious war. It's two rival religions arguing. It was Western, predominantly American liberalism on one hand, and Russian or Soviet communism on the other hand. And that these had the function of a religion for the people that actually believed in it. Because Carl Schmitt was outside of that paradigm. He was a traditional German nationalist. He was loyal to the Wilhelmine tradition. So he saw liberals and communists as the enemy, because first of all, Germany had fought 2 wars with them, and then afterwards they had carved up Germany into 2 countries. So he had some fairly penetrating insights there as well. But it is true that these modern ideologies do assume the role of a religion. We see that with this woke stuff today. I mean, we could compare that with a religion in many ways. And even something like, say, homosexuality, like in many traditional religions, homosexuality is a taboo or a sin or something like that. So it's interesting how what the woke religion does is they take homosexuality and invert it, and they sacralize it, and it becomes almost sacramental. For example, it's interesting to see how woke people are so aggressively in favor of gay marriage, when interestingly, they don't theoretically believe in marriage, or at least, marriage is not something they consider a sacrament. They're not Catholic usually, or very religious people, or, and so it's not like they think marriage is a sacrament. We got to promote marriage. But then they're so big on gay marriage. So what they're really doing is sacralizing homosexuality. And it's a case of what the speaker in the video we're discussing was talking about. He said what has happened is that in the late 20th century in the Western world, you see a culture that's developed that says, well, whatever was wrong in the past, we're going to just do the opposite of that to the nth degree. Like he's talking about the reaction against World War II. In World War II, you had, of course, the Holocaust and genocide and Nazism. And so now it's the idea is, well, we're just going to, whatever Nazis might have believed about anything, we're going to do the exact same opposite to the most fanatical degree possible. And we see that in a lot of different areas of thought and culture and society and that kind of stuff. It's sort of like we're just going to invert the past, whatever was the norm in the past, we're just going to reverse it. And, I mean, even on fairly trivial levels, like in some of the deep blue zones in the United States, where this kind of thinking is most prevalent. On one hand, they're legalizing marijuana and even hard drugs to some degree. At the same time, they're putting more restrictions on tobacco and even alcohol in some cases. Now, there's no rational reason for that. I mean, you can be a total prohibitionist, you could be a total, decriminalize all substances, psychoactive substances, or you could be somewhere in the middle. But the idea that you're going to, start saying, we got to crack down on tobacco, but we got to loosen up on these other drugs, that makes no rational sense whatsoever. It's clearly cultural. It's clearly ceremonial. Whatever was the norm in the past, we have to turn against it. And I think that's really sort of become the public religion for some people in today's world. And so that's one of the many things that video has a lot of really interesting insights about a lot of things, but that's one that I think really stands out.
All right, Swithin, his overall framing before we get in. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, they clearly do function as religions. I mean, the last time I quoted Durkheim, I'll do it again. A religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things set apart and forbidden, beliefs and practices which unite in one single moral community called the church, all of those who adhere to them. I mean, it's obviously clear that communism fills that. fascism and National Socialism fulfill that, and liberalism in particular, of the 20th century variety, which is really a form of progressivism, certainly is the belief in science, the belief in progress, the belief in sort of rationality, TM, etc., really clearly do function as religion. So in their sort of theoretical expositions, for most of the adherents, they do function as a religion. I suppose the exception to this, you could argue, possibly is forms of fascism, although really we can get to this later. When he refers to fascism, he really means National Socialism. He doesn't mean, at least theoretical Italian fascism, because even though everything is assumed within the state, I mean, clearly popular. I mean, the Muslim League was an atheist, clearly popular amongst Catholics, and now I suppose you can get the question, to what extent, is fascism just a reactionary government? There's various things like that, but I mean, certainly within fascism, you would think would be more. You could see that not functioning as a religion in the same way as the other two, just because of it's more amenable to like traditional Christian religion in a way that sort of progressivism isn't really. That said, of course, as I probably mentioned before, that progressivism is clearly a Christian heresy. So there is some kind of interplay there. And I suppose you could also argue Marxism clearly is a Christian heresy as well. But insofar, I think fascism is the one that's probably most amenable to keeping sort of traditional religion whilst having an economic and political structure, which doesn't really work in the same way for progressivism and communism. But I wouldn't take an absolute position on that. But broadly speaking, I think the idea of the modern wars of religion is perfectly reasonable.
Right. So, sort of using Ernst Junger's insight that, which I'm using, not what I thought is, that the technology is the metaphysics of the 20th century. That's sort of why he opens up with technology. And then basically there's science and scientism. So then there's liberalism, which is the one that predates the other two. So for him, the Great War is sort of like this turning point. So before the Great War, say that the century before, you had all this quote unquote material progress with science. And this material progress led people to believe that, we to paraphrase what he said, crack the code of life. We could just keep doing whatever because just superabundance everywhere, success everywhere. And then liberalism at the time was sort of the flagship ideology of like the British Empire and then the United States. But then World War I happened, which seemed to discredit liberalism, which gave rise to both fascism and communism. And then he says that as the underlying motivations for these religions, basically liberalism, he says, is, well, that's just the thing which, people like being left alone. People like making their own decisions. Freedom to own, property and guns and whatever is enjoyable. Fascism basically says that, nature is red in tooth and claw. We just need to admit this. Any deviation from this is just some sort of, soft-headed superstition. We just need to, outcompete and out-evolve our opponents. And then the communists are like, we'll just not look at the real world as it is and imagine a fairy tale. That's sort of how he describes it. He's like, the liberals are like, yeah, the reality can be harsh, but let's not be like psychopaths about it. The fascists are like, reality's harsh, and let's just embrace it. And then the communists are like, well, no, let's just not think about it at all and envision this utopia. Those seem to be the way he contextualizes these three. He argues that the fascists are an excessive masculine impulse. The communists are an excessive feminine impulse. He then talks about how with the fascists, they're the most consistent throughout history. He does seem to take the idea that fascism is just right-wing authoritarianism, because he says like the Qin in China, the Macedonians under Alexander would be considered fascist today, or like the Roman Empire. Which, okay, I mean, whether you want to accept that strictly speaking or not is another question. For the sake of his video, that's what he does believe. And so he does believe that fascism is more natural and will likely triumph at some point in the future. Not necessarily in this video, but in other videos that he made. He argues, as you pointed out, Swithin, that liberalism has changed meanings. It used to mean absence of government intervention and individual liberty. Now it seems to mean the opposite. And he argues that one of the reasons why it means the opposite now is that liberalism and communism have sort of merged into this hybrid managerialism, which has replaced both after the end of the Cold War. But then he argues that, so fascism owned itself by being so odious that everybody ganged up on it. Communism owned itself because it denied reality. And then the liberals are owning themselves because they're transgressive for the sake of being transgressive, doing everything the opposite of what what they think Hitler would have done. Whether or not that's actually what Hitler would have done is another question. And any sort of like balanced middle seems to be lost. That's his big overview on all that. So what do you think about that, Keith?
Yeah, talking about the difference between classical liberalism and modern progressivism, one thing he said in the video that was interesting was that how in modern progressivism is such that government basically intervenes in every aspect of society because to have the kinds of egalitarian ideals that that modern progressives tend to advocate for, you really have to have this elaborate enforcement mechanism. For instance, I recently saw where New York, I think it's New York City, is trying to enact, or maybe they did enact some kind of ordinance barring weight discrimination in employment. So now fat people are now another, protected class or whatever. And that actually got me thinking about something else I saw recently. I was watching an interview with Harpal Brar, who is the chairman of I don't know what his title is, but he's one of the leaders of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, which is a Stalinist organization. And he was discussing the state, and somebody was saying, well, what do you say in response to the people who say, well, communism favors an authoritarian, totalitarian state? And he said, well, you have that under capitalism too, because he was saying he was talking about how in a society like the United States, where you have this huge disparity between rich and poor, theoretically the masses are the enemy of the ruling class. So if the ruling class considers most people to be their enemy, then there has to be this elaborate enforcement mechanism to control the masses. And that actually got me thinking about the managerial revolution and the kind of what we call big government today. And it seems to me that what is largely happening in the West, particularly in the United States, is that as neoliberal economics have become more pervasive, and in the United States, we've seen the widening class divisions and things like that. Of course, it's well known that there's been a shift. The ruling class has tried to shift focus away from that towards cultural politics, about making everything inclusive and things like that. But all of that collectively serves as sort of an ideological smokescreen to justify those in power, but it also functions as a control mechanism. It's like instead of having the Stasi or the neighborhood block committees that you have in communist countries, nowadays we've got the human resources department in corporations. They're going to spy on you and make sure you're not discriminating against anybody or sexually harassing anybody, or you've got the people that go through social media looking to make sure you never posted anything politically incorrect when you were 10 or something like that. So yeah, it's interesting how the egalitarian ethos of liberalism has evolved into this. It's evolved into this managerial, ostensibly progressive state. And it's going to be interesting to see what the long-term impact of that is going to be. One thing that he discusses in the video that I think is interesting is, he talks about fascism and more conservative traditional societies, but there's a couple things I think he missed with that. One is towards the end of the video, he talks about how he thinks the world is moving back towards a more rural, less technological existence. And I'm not sure that's the case. I could see that happening in developed countries. I could see a regression of that type. But it's also true that around the world, there's been an explosion in development and growth in places like Asia and the South Pacific and even Africa to some degree. So I think he's discounting certain parts of the world. Also, another thing that seems to be happening worldwide is there seems to be a rise around the world of what might be called conservative socialism in opposition to Western liberal capitalism. Um, if you look around the world at all the different countries and movements that oppose the West, all of them have sort of, or many of them have adopted what amounts to a conservative sociocultural framework, but a quasi-socialist economic framework. Now they're not hardcore Marxist-Leninists, like Maoism and Stalinism. They've abandoned some of the economic extremism associated with communism, but that actually makes them stronger because they're able to have more functional economies. China's the obvious example of that. I mean, China is still ruled by the Communist Party. But it's seen explosive development and growth in the last 40 years, in part because of the market reforms, where they're not trying to, be an industrial society that makes iron in backyard stoves or something anymore. They become a real economy if you have the bullet trains and all of that kind of stuff. And we're starting to see growth like that in India, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, and some of the African countries. And then if you look at the Eastern nations that are aligned with each other, they all practice what by American standards would be socialism of some type, but it's a type of conservative socialism. It's not anything like what Westerners today think of as the left. It's not this pink and green and rainbow left. It's more like, well, Putin's a good example. I mean, Russia today is basically a Russian Orthodox nationalist state that practices a type of national capitalism, or socialism with Russian characteristics or something. And that seems to be the norm in the anti-Western world increasingly. So you're seeing this ideological conflict emerge once again. It's sort of like the more traditional cultures and the Western liberalism. But then the whole socialist versus liberal thing has sort of been reversed. You're starting to see a type of conservative socialism, or really what it is third positionism. It's anti-capitalism, but culturally, nationally conservative. And I'm curious as to what the future of that is going to be as well. And I don't think he really considers that very well.
Okay, Swithin.
I agree with Keith. The way in which sort of conservative socialism has gone, it seems to have changed from what would be known in sort of like the 80s and to a large extent the 90s as well. That conservatism was basically in politics a soft version of fusionism, which was certainly true. On a slightly different note, I think Otis's approach to basically the Second World War is interesting, but the problem. I know it's not purely the Second World War, but to a large extent, it's based around that. Is whilst in theory, international communism, national socialism, and fascism are and liberalism. Doesn't distinguish between socialism and fascism. Are in theory very different. But in practice, so they're very different legitimizing ideologies for the states that run those geographical areas. But I mean, in practice, is there really that much difference between National Socialism and Hitler and Stalinist Russia? I mean, were they equally masculine? Are they equally feminine? I mean, the idea that somehow the communists were somehow appropriately feminine and had this sort of like this sort of golden mean between masculine and feminine somehow meant they would be able to defeat the fascists is bizarre. You could argue maybe that for liberalism in a way, but the excesses that they have in theory are not necessarily the excesses they have in practice, and so. So I think that's a big sort of issue, especially when it comes to specifically fascism. So if I restrict myself, now I am far from an expert, but if you look at sort of Italian fascism, the heavy theoretical influences is like George Sorel, who's an anarcho-syndicalist. And really, fascism in theory is supposed to be national syndicalism. Now, you're supposed to have like work. Yeah, if I remember correctly, you're supposed to have a big council and all the economics aspects of society are represented all within the state, and it's supposed to be a big corporate body. Now, did Italian fascism actually run like that? No. In the same way that theoretical socialism, and again, you can say, well, this couldn't really happen in sort of Russia. That didn't really happen either. So, I mean, when you're looking at, well, who wins, unless you're going to make the argument that somehow there was a better ideology which helped the soldiers fight better, you've really got to look at the more of the practical mechanics of how each of those states were run to determine, what gave them the advantage. I mean, clearly the economic policies of the Soviets caused them serious harm, which is why they all dependent on Western technology, as Anthony Sutton points out. I mean, that was all the interwar period. So they clearly make a difference as the ideology, but what matters is the ideology put into practice rather than what the theoretical positions are. Because this is, to some extent, James Burnham's point in the Managerial Revolution, is that the Western capitalist societies are equally managerial societies as the Soviet Union was. I mean, I looked at some photos of the Soviet Union from the 1960s, and I was like, well, I didn't know it was Russia. I might think it was some sort of capitalist society. They've got roads, they've got modern cars and buildings and things. I mean, is it really that different? Well, in a sense, yes. But I think his analysis would be more incisive if he was to make a clearer distinction between, in theory, what those states were supposed to just support and what in practice they ended up doing. And also, related to that, he should really make a difference between National Socialism and fascism, because they are really rather different, at least theoretically.
Yeah, well, so there's a few points here. I think, on the one hand, I would agree with you, Swithin, that whether you say, once you have a sufficiently advanced industrial technological society, they're going to all look practically the same from a operational point of view, which is why some people, well, for example, I just finished going through FDR and Wall Street and FDR by Anthony Sutton. And he claims in one of his citations that Herbert Hoover considered the swoop plan fascism and wouldn't accept it. So then a lot of the Wall Street donors shifted their support to FDR. Now, the fact is, and then on top of that, we have John Maynard Keynes at one point said that under National Socialist Germany, you could most effectively implement his economic policies. So clearly there's a sense in which, on a practical level, the differences go away. And that's in part because they're all competing for the same thing, technology, right? Again, as Ernst Jünger said, techne is the metaphysic of our age. Think of it like the Catholics and the Orthodox arguing over who's the true church in the Middle Ages. They're both arguing over Christianity, but they are coming at it from different justification perspectives. And I think that's what we see here with all this. And that's also, I think, why there's like this socialist liberal hybrid that's running the West, because once you have all these complex interlocking systems, there's a kind of like imposition that technology imposes on society. It makes it less flexible and less able to make its own decisions, because any decisions you make are contingent upon relying upon that system in the first place. The other thing he didn't really talk about was how, given he framed it in light of technology is very capital intensive. And the reason why the liberal regimes won is that the liberal regimes were best able to capitalize in order to develop technology. I guess you could say if we had a Cold War with fascists, would it have been different? Would they have been better able to capitalize than... He seems to think so. He seems to think if any right-wing reactionary group led Russia instead of communism, which he thinks is just a joke, Russia would be a great power even now and would be far more advanced than it is now. That's an open question, because I think Tsardom had a lot of problems, but regardless, that's his video. And I think that's interesting. The idea that, and he hits this again throughout, is that he has this love-hate view with technology. On the one hand, he likes how easy the world is, at least for him, and the opportunities that are available. But then he also sees that it leads to all these negative externalities, which are, one, radically different from all of prior human civilization, two, radically undermining our current civilization, three, leading it to a likely collapse. Now, he doesn't want to be black pill. He doesn't really do black pill videos. He's like, well, we can somehow, correct course and steer the ship of state to some better destination. And I think he's trying to be optimistic for his videos. But sometimes I wonder if he really is that optimistic deep down, because I don't really see a lot of these changes even being discussed to be implemented to salvage whatever is left. And this idea that we don't have he also mentioned that when the 19th century, when science created the illusion that we had conquered nature, that led to a decline in religiosity. And that decline in religiosity, he argues, was then filled by the vacuum of these modern religions, these secular religions. But now that the promise of science isn't really coming true, the last one standing, quote unquote, liberalism. Now, you're right, Keith, the conservative socialist element from China and Eastern Europe is sort of being ignored here. So how that would stand in comparison to all the others is not clear. But then again, this wouldn't be a secular war of religion, though, right? Because a lot of these other groups are going to be overtly religious. Putin's overtly religious. Iran's overtly religious. Not even in this sort of like synthetic ideological sense. And so I don't know, but I do appreciate his skepticism of technology, and I think that that's a very useful framing device for the wars of secular religion. Also, to your point, Swithin, as to why somebody won, someone didn't. Really, the reason why the Axis powers lost World War II was economics. I mean, the Allies, especially the United States, which he does make reference to, liberalism won because the U.S. was on its side. If the U.S. had been any other ideology, that ideology would have won. But then the question is, why did the U.S. remain liberal? And then why did the liberal U.S. have such an economic powerhouse? Because this sort of like, he mentions a lot throughout that the fascists had higher fighting spirit. Not the Italians, though. They were garbage. So maybe that's why he left them out, Sweat, and they just didn't fight very well. But ultimately, that fighting spirit didn't really matter against economic power. Now, that might be changing because the United States has all the economic power, but it lost the war on terror. So we'll see what that means. Keith, any of your thoughts?
One point that he keeps raising throughout that video that I think may be an overstatement is he seems to discount the durability of liberalism to a greater degree than I think might be warranted. For example, he talks about how, well, after the end of the Cold War, liberalism seemed to triumph, and we had people like, I don't know if he mentions Francis Fukuyama or not, but you had people like that saying, well, liberalism is the end of history or whatever. And he even has at one point in the video a map. He shows how more and more countries became quote unquote liberal over time. But he seems to have the idea that liberalism is imploding or that it's going away. And while I think that there's some truth to that in the sense that in recent years there's been a pushback against the pervasiveness of liberalism in the post-Cold War period. I mentioned the rise of this conservative socialism or whatever we want to call it in Russia and China and places like that. It's also true that if anything, I think liberalism is more pervasive now than it's ever been, because if we look at the different parts of the world and different countries, you can see all kinds of trends that indicate that. One is the fact that, I think I mentioned this in the last program we did, Todd, something like 77% of the world's countries have now abolished the death penalty. I think either formally or informally, either they repealed it legally or they just discontinued the use of it. Now, that's rather astounding from a world historical perspective, considering historically, you could get the death penalty for, looking at a social superior the wrong way or all kinds of things. So the fact that you have a move towards abolishing the death penalty globally, I think, indicates the pervasiveness of, if you want to call it liberalism or something, it's not fascism, it's not traditional societies, it's not communism. So it's and also we have to consider the power of American, Western generally, particularly American cultural imperialism. American economic power may be receding due to the fact that, more and more countries are trying to move away from the dollar as the reserve currency and things like that. Also, American military power may be receding due to overreach and getting into one war after another and losing. But American cultural power, I think, is the most pervasive form of American power. It's military and economic, while important, or secondary to cultural power. And American cultural power is still extremely pervasive everywhere. You can go to countries, even those that are enemies of the United States, and find McDonald's and find people listening to American pop music and watching American movies and all kinds of stuff. Like I know someone who used to tell a story about going to Vietnam and seeing Vietnamese kids on the streets trying to ape the mannerisms of American rappers and that kind of stuff. Nowadays you have McDonald's in Cambodia, next to memorials to the killing fields and stuff like that. So American and Western and liberal, by extension, cultural power is extremely pervasive. And more countries now have a Western style government than any other point in history in terms of a parliamentary or presidential state. So I think he may be discounting the durability of liberalism to a greater degree. He seems to have the view, well, liberalism is going to pass just like fascism and communism from the 20th century, and then we're going to go back to something like, almost like a pre-modern society with the authoritarian autocratic governments and less technology and much lower living standards. Yeah, that could happen, at least in certain parts of the world. But I think that he may be overstating his arguments there.
Okay, Swithin.
American cultural hegemony is interesting. Whether it will continue, I think maybe to a large extent be dependent on the American economic system still being sort of the world's largest and most powerful. Because in the absence of, well, for one thing, with the absence of economic power, the amount of money that's going to be devoted to cultural creation is probably going to go down for anything. So there'll just be less for the rest of the world to consume in that respect. Also, when it comes to the cultural stuff, I don't know if it's as obvious in many cases, but something like American aid is tied to basically promoting feminism in the third world. And stuff like that. They definitely tried to do that in Afghanistan. Now, to what extent that makes a difference is another question, because you could argue, well, it's really all movies and all that kind of stuff. So that makes a bigger difference rather than sort of like the educational programs. But I think that does make a significant difference, and also as well, this is the 19th century. To a large extent, I think the American cultural influence comes from intellectual property law, which is actually enforced by basically every country in the world. They have their own copyright laws, and etc. Now, I read that the Russians were basically ignoring it on American products. Now, to what extent they're doing that is another question, because my understanding is the way the copyright and intellectual property laws work is that each country enforces their own laws, and so if, say, Warner Brothers wanted to file a suit in Russia, it would be under Russian law and Russian judges, etc. Now, I don't know of any cases in which they've lost because the Russians go, nah, Warner Brothers don't care. Although in theory it's possible. But I think to the extent that the kind of the intellectual property laws weaken, and which will weaken to the extent that technology becomes better, because to the extent that it's easy to replicate things, and then also with AI, I think I may have discussed this in the AI episode, it's going to be a lot easier for people with small amount of money to create things that are pretty darn visually impressive, which I think will weaken the cultural hegemony. That said, I think one of the reasons why America has cultural hegemony is because English has become the world language. And I think that's become the world language primarily because of economic reasons. If it was the case that the world language was to change from being English, then the American influence would diminish significantly because, well, what's the point of associating yourself with American English stuff when you can associate with, say, Chinese or Spanish, for instance? And that would reduce it. So I am not that quick to say that sort of the current sort of, if we call it state capitalism, we call it liberalism, whatever we want to call it, the current economic dispensation which exists in the West. There's been many predictions of sudden collapse, which never been borne out as of yet. So it is a more robust system than one might think. But I do ultimately think it is unsustainable. And I think once that does happen, I think the cultural impact will diminish somewhat. Now, I suppose you could argue I'm going on some sort of like economic determinism position here that culture follows economics, but I am only in a very limited sense that why people take hold of it and why it goes in the places it does is ultimately from the economic base. So those would be my broad thoughts on the future of sort of liberal Western liberal capitalism as such.
Right. Now, of course, he's done many videos on like collapse or end of civilizations or whatever. The video we're discussing today does not really get into that, though he can't help but get into it a little bit because that's sort of been his bread and butter for a while. I think maybe the next video we do is going to get into one of his collapse videos. But I think what's interesting here is why is he saying this, right? Because on the one hand, as you've said, Keith, there's the cultural hegemony that's going on. There's also, as you've said, Swithin, it's the economic structure seems more resilient than we would otherwise expect. He's looking at the cycle of civilizations from a guy named Turchin. I don't really know what this guy's angle is. He seems to have influenced What If Alt Hist a lot. And that it seems to predict historical crises, well, post-dict, I guess, historical crises based on his model. And he's saying that, well, based on this model, if you trust it or not, and how influential you think models are, we're overdue for something like this. He also claims that Turchin's model illustrates that civilizations fall for much the same reasons. You know, economic collapse, population collapse, military defeats, etc., etc. And at one point in the video, he claims that you can actually like the framework model that Turchin developed to then pinpoint collapse points were accurate to the year, like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution or something like that. So part of why he's really leading into this is because he believes that this is a very effective way of describing the cycles. There's also, I forget who wrote the book, The Fourth Turning. And there's something like every 80 years, America has a crisis. You know, the first crisis was the Civil War, after the Revolution. And then after that, it was World War II. And then after that, it's, you know, where we're at now. And so he's sort of looking at this like cyclical pattern and saying that these academics who give plausible accounts, if they're right, we're well on track for another one of these things. So, Keith, how plausible or how reliable do you think all that is?
On one hand, I tend to be somewhat skeptical of historical theories that are, I guess, deterministic would be the word, meaning that history unfolds according to, you know, set patterns or specifically identifiable patterns. Some theories like that I think are more plausible than others, but I don't know that any of them have a full explanatory power. As far as, you know, whether we're headed for some kind of collapse or something of that nature, I tend to think that the way the West is going is, I don't know that there's going to be a dramatic collapse. I tend to be more of the view that there's going to be slow stagnation. For instance, the United States seems to me to be becoming more and more like a Latin American country, where you have the same level of corruption that you find in Latin America. You have the same kind of divisions between rich and poor. You find the same squalor among the lower socioeconomic orders. You have the same kind of clownish, oafish political leaders. You have the same kind of violence on the periphery between extremist groups and things like that. But societies like that exist all over the world and have existed for quite some time. So I think I tend to be more of the view at present that the West generally, and I think specific. I don't know about Europe. I think there are other variables that are in play in Europe, but the United States seems to be headed in the same direction as a country like, say, Brazil or something like that. I tend to think that that's probably what the United States is going to look like in the future. So we're going to see more of a slow decline, where the United States is not going to really be this dominant hegemonic power that it's been in the past. And I think that will have implications as far as the world economy, obviously, and culturally. One thing about American cultural power is that the American cultural elite really exists as a society unto themselves, and I think that they tend to identify less with America and more with comparable elites in other comparable countries like Europe. Increasingly, maybe even somewhere like Japan or Australia or somewhere like that. If you look at the kinds of attitudes that the American cultural elite, which are mostly the people that produce the popular culture, if you look at their attitudes towards real Americans, so to speak, the American common people, they basically view American commoners as ingrates that need to be put on a reservation or something like that. So I think American popular culture could exist on a global scale, even if America itself became if the scope of American military and economic influence was reduced significantly. I still think American popular culture would still be there, because the society behind it is really sort of a society unto itself. Is it really even America, or is it a branch of this kind of Northern Hemisphere ruling class? And I think that you have parts of the world where you have a country, say, that's not a particularly great country in terms of being a world power, but they still have a very long reach in some cultural sense, or in some area of the economy. Japan, for example, and making automobiles and electronic products, or Israel has a reach way beyond its numbers and its size, and so does Saudi Arabia because of petroleum. And I think that the whole American media, American entertainment industry, that I think could be something like the equivalent of the Saudi petroleum industry or the Japanese electronics industry, even if America itself is a much reduced international power.
Okay, Swithin.
As I mentioned before, I think that to a large extent depends on development of technology and to what extent you can create a substitute for the American entertainment system. They still have a very big advantage, and I don't think it will diminish immediately. But with technology, you can replicate in a way that you can't replicate oil. Although I do always hear stories about how you can create oil in labs and stuff. So I suppose there are ways of ways of doing that. Always is general approach with the sort of cycle of civilization. Another one I read, which is kind of the Strauss and Howe one. I remember reading about. Want to know better? There was an English guy who was he a general? He was in civil service, I think, in the Arab era in the early 20th century. A lot of these general theories effectively boil down to strong men create good times, good times create weak men produce hard times effectively. It is basically the meme. And that's essentially what they typically argue. Sorry, the guy basically argues is a guy called his name right, John Glubb, Sir John Glubb. who effectively makes this, and he makes these arguments with respect to Arab society, how when it becomes decadent and it's in its decline, the role women's become much more prominent in the public sphere, etc. Again, not too dissimilar from, say, the way in which J.D. Unwin would hold. I mean, they're probably similar time period, actually. So that tends to be how the cycle of civilization stuff tends to work. Although the interesting thing there is it's a kind of a practical, non-ideological one. Although it'd be interesting to see how you could map on a general change in sort of ideology based on these sort of, you could argue, fundamental trends. I mean, related to that, actually, I remember I read recently an article by Emil Kierkegaard. He'd done a paper with Ed Dutton amongst others and looked at based on a data set from Roman times, the bones, and calculated something called polygenic score, which I don't know what it is, but apparently is a good proxy for IQ, and it's a way of trying to measure. Now, to what extent this is robust is another question, but they did this test on the various skeletons from various time periods of Roman history, and it's what you would expect if, from this kind of position, is that in the Republic, IQ is at highest, but Republic created good times, and so then in the Imperial period, it went down. Again, basically, this is following the kind of sort of quasi biological determinist position. You know, it's harsh conditions create increased childhood mortality. Only the strongest survive, the most intelligent, etc. And then you get increases in life expectancy. Children otherwise wouldn't die, don't die. The conditions become less harsh, and so don't select for intelligence in the same way. And they argue essentially this is borne out by the measurement of the polygenic scores from the skeletons from the Roman period. Although there's issues with respect to, are they all Roman? It's difficult to tell. The sample size is very low, but I thought that was somewhat of interest. So I don't know of any other general form of cycle of civilization. It just tend to go that way. And I do think there is truth to it. I just think it's somewhat underdetermined, and it needs to have a lot more sort of empirical and historical contingent factors to take place. And I think that's the big problem with when you take the cycle of civilization arguments, is that you end up just holding to too much of an abstract position and not paying attention to the particulars of the times.
Right. Okay. So we're moving into the final statements. I'll just sum up that I think you can sum up the entire video in the left hand. Worshipping the left side of the brain is bad, creating all the problems we're dealing with now. We need more right brain expressions, and if I agree. So, Keith Preston, final thoughts.
I think that the video outlines a very interesting analysis and interpretation of modern history, even if I don't buy all of his conclusions entirely. One thing I'd point out, though, about the video is that it has really a lot of interesting nuggets of information in it that are, really just sort of a side issue when it comes to the theme of the video, but are still really interesting. Like one is he talks about how family structures influence the type of governmental systems that societies have. He argues that in societies where the nuclear family is more common, you tend to have liberal governments. In countries where the more traditional patriarchal family is dominant, you tend to have more what he calls fascist or right-wing authoritarian governmental systems. And in countries where the more extended family is more pervasive or influential, they tend to trend more towards communism or be more susceptible to communism. But yeah, there really is a lot of bits and pieces of it. It's kind of like reading a book where some of the most interesting parts of the book are actually in footnotes that are just intended by the author as a side issue, but that ends up being just as interesting as the central theme. So it's definitely worth checking out.
All right, final thoughts, Swithin. I agree with Todd's assessment. In the prescriptive aspect, I broadly agree with all his. And as Keith pointed out, I do think the relationship between family structure and economic ideology and stuff is interesting, because it's always been argued sort of, well, it's not always been, but the argument that the nuclear family and stuff in Northern Europe led to sort of capitalism and, well, liberalism more precisely, and more communitarians or more extended family stuff in the Mediterranean lent itself to sort of like forms of, well, fascism amongst other things. So I agree with both of you.
All right, this is Todd Lewis, the Prize of Five podcast, signing off.